everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am back with a brand new tutorial for how to make what may very well be the world's coziest sweater. I made this last year and I love it so much that I was wearing it like multiple times a week. So this year I decided I'd like a second sweater so that I don't end up wearing like the same sweater just over and over and over again. And I thought I would take you on the journey with me to crochet this new sweater and teach you how to do it yourself.
Let's go over our materials. So to make this sweater, I'll be using this Heartland yarn by Lion Brand. This video is not sponsored, but hey, if anybody at Lion Brand is watching, hit me up. Anyway, I'm using this Heartland yarn by Lion Brand. I used it to make the blue sweater as well, and it's held up pretty well considering how often I was wearing that blue sweater, so I'm going to be using it again. And I used 6 skeins of this. You may need more or less depending on the size of sweater you're making. Now, if you can't find this exact yarn, any medium worsted weight yarn will do. This yarn calls for a 6mm crochet hook, so if you find a yarn that you like that calls for a 6mm crochet hook, it should be about the right size for this. Next, you're going to need 2 different sizes of crochet hook, one for the ribbing and one for the main body of the sweater. For the ribbing, I'm using this size G 4mm crochet hook. I've had this hook for a long time and it's my preferred hook for things like this. And for my sweater, I'm doing the main body in Tunisian Crochet, so I have this 8mm Tunisian Crochet hook. Now you may notice that both of my hooks are not the size that this yarn recommends. This yarn recommends a 6mm crochet hook, and we're going to be using a 4 and 8mm crochet hook. This is just because the ribbing looks better when it's done with a slightly smaller hook, and I find that I like Tunisian knit stitch better when it's done with a slightly larger hook than the yarn recommends. Next, you're going to need a measuring tape. This sweater isn't worked in sizes like small, medium, and large. It's worked based on your measurements, so you need a measuring tape in order to get accurate measurements. Next, you're going to need a couple of stitch markers to mark your place, and a tapestry needle to help you sew everything together. I've included links to the materials that I've used down in the description if you are interested in using the exact same materials that I used, but whatever crochet materials you have on hand will work just fine for this.
Okay, so before we get started with the tutorial, I thought I'd take a moment to sit by this very realistic fireplace and tell you all about kind of how this pattern works. So unlike a lot of wearable patterns where there's variations for like small, medium, and large, we're actually going to do this based on measurements, so you can customize it to your exact body type. You may be the kind of person where you want it to go down to like all the way down to your knees. With this pattern, you can actually do that. All you need to do is take some basic measurements. So you would need to measure from the top of your shoulder all the way down to wherever it is that you want your sweater to end. So in my case, I wanted my sweater to end just above my hip.
You also need to measure around your widest area that the sweater is going to have to go over. So for some of us, that's our chest. For others, that's our hips. Just whatever's the widest area, take a measurement around there.
The next measurement that you need to take is from the base of your neck all the way down to your wrist where you want the sleeve to end. And that's going to give us our measurement for our shoulders as well as our arm. And the rest of it, we're going to work out with math. Now, I could already hear some of you groaning and saying, oh, I don't want to do math. But if you fit the average demographic for this channel, that means you're an adult. And this is elementary school level math. Get your shit together.
And this probably goes without saying, but make sure you write your measurements down. To recap, here's a list of all the measurements you'll need. You can also find this list down in the description for this video. All right, so the first thing we're going to crochet is the back panel. Now this sweater is crocheted in 2 separate panels, a back panel and a front panel. They are almost identical up until the last 10 rows, at which point they change up a little bit. So we're going to start with the back panel because it's just a big rectangle. It's crocheted from the bottom up, starting with the ribbing, and then moving on to the main body. The first thing we need to do is determine how long our ribbing needs to be, and we do that by taking our widest area measurement and dividing that by 2. To give you an example, my widest area measured 100 centimeters. Divided by 2, that means 50 centimeters. Half of that widest area goes in the front, half of that widest area goes in the back, for a total of 100 centimeters. And for my fellow Americans wondering why I'm using centimeters instead of inches, it's really just because centimeters are a smaller unit and I can round up to the nearest whole centimeter without throwing off my size too much. If you want to use inches, go ahead. For me, using centimeters is easier. The ribbing is basically just a long, skinny scarf that's made using consecutive rows of back loop single crochets. See a back loop single crochet, then you chain 1 and turn, and back loop single crochet the other way, and that's what gives us the ribbing effect. And you just keep repeating those rows until you have a ribbon that measures half of your widest area. And before we dive into the actual instructions here, I just want to take a moment to let some of you know that we are going to be going pretty fast. I'm assuming that you know the basic stitches for crochet. I'm also assuming this is not your first project. For those of you who still think I'm going too fast, there's a lot you can do in the video settings to slow down the pace of this video. You can go into the settings and slow down the speed, or you can pause the video until you catch up to where I am. But for the sake of this video, I'm assuming that you already basically know how to crochet. To make this ribbing, we're going to need our smaller hook. For me, that's my size G 4mm crochet hook. And I'm going to start by chaining 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then I'm going to single crochet 1 in every chain across for a total of 6 stitches. So starting in the second chain from the hook, I'm going to single crochet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, chain 1, and turn. From here on out, we're going to be doing back loop single crochets only. So right down the middle and through the back loop and single crochet. That's 1, and 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then we chain 1 and turn, and we do another row of back loop single crochets. And you just repeat that until you have a ribbon that measures half of your widest area. In my case, that's 50 centimeters. Once your ribbing has reached your desired length, you can go ahead and give it a measure just to be sure, and give it a little stretch just to make sure that you did everything right. And then we are going to do 1 single crochet at the top of every row. So instead of going across the 6 stitches wide like we did before, we're actually going to turn it on its side, chain 1, and put 1 single crochet at the top of every row. So for me, I had 70 rows in my ribbing, so I'll end up with 70 stitches across, 1 stitch in the top of every row. And make sure that you stitch these a little looser than you normally would, because once we're done with this row, we're going to change to our larger hook, and these stitches need to be wide enough that your larger hook can fit through them. So find the space at the top of your first row and single crochet 1 in every row for the length of the ribbing. You'll notice that some rows it's easy to find a space to single crochet, and other rows it's difficult to find a space. You're really going to have to try and force your hook through there. That's kind of how you know you're doing it right. You should have alternating easy spaces, difficult spaces, but as long as at the end of the day you have as many stitches as you did rows in your ribbing, it should all work out fine.
All right, everybody. So somehow all of my footage that I had shot from the original sweater for this back panel got deleted. I must have accidentally deleted it somehow. So now I am re-recording it, but I don't have enough yarn to like make an entire new panel. So I'm just going to do this little swatch. The concept is still the same though. So none of you guys are idiots. I'm sure you all can figure it out from a tiny swatch versus a large swatch. It's the same thing. And so once you reach the end, don't chain 1, just pull up a loop, because we're going to be changing to our Tunisian crochet hook. So we're going to flip it over so that we're facing the right way. And then we're going to grab our Tunisian crochet hook and insert it into the loop. And now we're going to go through every single stitch and pull up a loop. I'm assuming that if you're doing a Tunisian crochet tutorial, you kind of know how to do Tunisian crochet. But for those of you that don't, basically what you do is you, instead of pulling up a loop and then yarning over and pulling through, you pull up a loop in every stitch, and then you do a pass where you pull through. It's called the return pass. But yeah, so this loop on our hook is going to count as the loop for this first single crochet. So we're going to go into the second
stitch from our hook and pull up a loop, just like this, and into the third stitch, which sometimes is difficult, and pull up a loop, into the fourth stitch, and pull up a loop just like this. So just keep pulling up loops, one for every stitch. You should end up with the same number of loops on your hook as you have stitches. So for me, I've got 25 stitches here, so I'll end up with 25 loops on my hook. Okay, so now I should have 25 loops on my hook. And now to do our return pass, the first thing we need to do, or the first stitch, we're going to yarn over and pull through one loop. And then for the remaining loops, we're going to yarn over and pull through two at a time. So we yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, and so on until you reach the end of your row. Okay, so now I've reached the end of my row. And so this is our kind of Tunisian foundation stitch. And the rest of this is going to be worked using a Tunisian knit stitch, which is a really nice stitch because it looks a lot like knitting, but you don't have to fiddle around with like two different hooks and stuff. So I actually prefer Tunisian knit stitch to just regular knitting. With Tunisian crochet, the first loop on your hook always counts as the first stitch. So you're going to go into the second stitch from the hook. You'll see that there's kind of this loop right here. Let me try. There we go. You're going to go through the middle of it. So you've kind of got one side of the loop on one side of your hook and the other on the other side. And so you just go kind of diagonally through and pull it up. So you'll see just like that. So it looks very similar to knitting. So then you go through the next one, just right through the center of it and pull up a loop. And I do have a video tutorial about the basics for Tunisian crochet as well as basics for Tunisian knit stitch. If you need a little bit more help or a little bit more information on how to do Tunisian knit stitch, I'll leave a link for that down in the description. But just go across your row and pull up a loop for every stitch. And then when you get to the end, the last stitch on your row is a little bit special. So the last stitch, you can see there's kind of like two loops like this. You try and get your hook through those two loops so that it gives you a nice kind of clean end. If you don't manage to do it that way, I mean, it'll still be fine. I just like doing it this way because it gives it kind of a nice clean edge. So then just like we did before, we're going to yarn over and pull through one loop for the first one. And then we're going to yarn over and pull through two loops for all of the remaining stitches on our hook. So yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, and so on. So we're just going to repeat what we did for the previous row until we have a length that measures the same as our shoulder to hip measurement, or our shoulder to wherever, however long you want your sweater to be. And when you do the measurement, you include the ribbing. So for me, my shoulder to hip measurement was, what was it, 50 centimeters, I think. So I'm going to keep crocheting rows until I reach a length that is 50 centimeters, including the ribbing. So the ribbing counts as part of that. Now, because again, this is the second time I am filming this, I actually don't have enough yarn to fully make a 50 centimeter length. So I'm just going to do a couple extra rows and then show you kind of what that looks like once you have, you know, more than 2 rows. Now, even though we're doing this based off of measurements, still keep track of how many rows you're doing. We're going to keep track of that because for our front panel, we do want to make sure that we have the same number of rows because we want them to be even. So just keep track of how many rows you make so that you can have the exact same number of rows for your front panel, because we want them to be even and we want them to match up. So just keep on repeating rows of Tunisian knit stitch until you have
your desired length, and I will meet you back here when that's all done. All right, so I'm about to run out of yarn, so let's just pretend that I have a panel that measures 50 centimeters, because that's what I originally needed. Once you have the length that you need, you can go ahead and just chain one, and then cut your yarn to finish off. And that's it, the back panel is done.
Now let's make the front panel.
So the back panel and the front panel are pretty much identical down to the last 10 rows. So you should have kept track of how many rows of Tunisian you had. In my case, my original back panel had 70 rows of Tunisian, which means that for my front panel, I will crochet it just like I did the back panel, up to 60 rows. And then at 60 rows, we're going to change it up a little bit. So repeat these steps for your front panel up until the last 10 rows. And then once you have this done for the front panel up to the last 10 rows, then we'll come back together and we'll do the last 10 rows together. So repeat these steps for your front panel, and I will meet you here when you are ready to do the last 10 rows.
Okay, so now I have my front panel crocheted up to the last 10 rows, and now we need to mark off where our neck opening is going to be. In order to make the neck opening, we need to mark off the middle 10 or 11 stitches. The reason why it's 10 or 11 is because you need an even number of stitches on either side of it to mark off your shoulders. So count how many stitches wide your sweater is. If you have an odd number of stitches, you're going to subtract 11 from that number. If you have an even number of stitches, you're going to subtract 10 from that number, and then divide the remainder by 2. So for example, my sweater is 70 stitches wide. That means I have an even number of stitches. So I'm going to subtract 10 from that number to give me 60. Then I'm going to divide that by 2 to give me 30 stitches per shoulder. If I were to have, say, 71 stitches in my row instead of 70, I would subtract 11 because I have an odd number of stitches. By subtracting 11, I get 60, and I can divide 60 evenly into 2 shoulders. So count your stitches in your row, figure out if you have an odd number of stitches or an even number of stitches, and subtract either 10 or 11 to know how wide your shoulders need to start. So if you've got a larger than average head, you may want to have your neck opening space be 14 or 15 stitches instead of 10 or 11 stitches. You know your body. You know how big your head is. You can use your own discretion. But if you think you're going to need more space, you can always widen that area. The formula to work out how wide your shoulders are going to be is still the same. Once you know how many stitches wide your shoulders need to be, go ahead and insert a stitch marker where the neck opening will begin. So in my case, I'm counting 30 stitches and I'm putting a stitch marker at the end. And then I'm going to the other side and I'm counting 30 stitches in there and I'm putting a stitch marker at the end. This is just a good reminder of where your shoulders are starting and stopping, just in case you kind of lose count or stop paying attention. I do that sometimes. So it's just kind of a good little insurance policy to make sure that you don't lose count. Once you have your shoulder placement worked out, we can go ahead and start crocheting. Starting where we left off for the previous row, we are going to pull up a loop for every stitch of our shoulder. So in my case, I'm pulling up 30 loops. And once we pull up the requisite number of loops, we're going to do our return pass. For every row from here on out, there will be a decrease at the end of the row. So we have 9 rows left. That means we're going to do 9 rows with decreases. To do this, we're going to pull up a loop in every stitch until the final 3 stitches. So in my case, my shoulders have 30 stitches. So I'm going to pull up a loop in 27 stitches. Once I reach the last 3 stitches, I'm going to decrease. So you put your hook through the front loop of the first stitch and then directly through the next stitch. Pull up a loop through both stitches. So that's 1 loop for the 2 stitches. And then pull up a loop in the next stitch as you normally would. Then do your return pass. As I mentioned earlier, I do have a video for the basics for Tunisian knit stitch if you need more information on how to do decreases. So from here on out, every row will have a decrease at the end. You need 9 decrease rows in total, and at the end of it, your row count should be the same between the front and back panels. So let's do one last row together and then I will leave you to it. So I'm going to pull up a loop in every stitch until the last 3 stitches in my row. Then I'm going to decrease in the next 2 stitches and then pull up my loop in the last stitch as usual, and then do my return pass. So every row from here on out will have a decrease at the end. You pull up a loop in every stitch until the last 3 stitches, decrease, and then pull up a loop in the last stitch. For every row, your stitch count should decrease by 1. So I will leave you to it, and I will meet you back here when that's all done. All right, so once you come to the end of your final round, you can chain 1 to finish off and go ahead and cut your yarn. Cut the tail a little longer than you typically would so that you can use it to sew the front and the back pieces together. And now we'll move on to the next shoulder. So the method for crocheting the right shoulder is the same as it was for crocheting the left, just in reverse. So when we were crocheting the left shoulder, we did a series of regular knit stitches followed by a decrease. For the right shoulder, we're going to do a decrease followed by a series of regular knit stitches. So find the area where you marked off your right shoulder to start. Place your yarn on your hook and pull it through the stitch. Then chain 1 to fasten into place. The loop on your hook is going to count as your first stitch for the row. Then pull up 1 loop for every stitch remaining in the row. And then do your return pass. For every row from here on out, we are going to start with a decrease. In the first 2 stitches from your hook, decrease, and then pull up a loop in every stitch remaining in the row. Every row after this will have this pattern. Decrease, then pull up a stitch in all the remaining stitches. Do this for the next 9 rows. So because we already went over this method together while doing the left shoulder, and the right shoulder is the exact same method, only in reverse, I'm going to leave you here. So complete 9 decrease rows, and I will meet you back here when that's all done. Once you come to the end of your final row, you can chain 1 to fasten it off and go ahead and cut your yarn. Just like we did for the other shoulder, leave a long tail so that you can use it to sew the front panels and the back panels together. So now that we have the front panels and the back panels all made, we need to connect the shoulders together. So with the right sides facing in, connect the front and the back panels together at the shoulders. Make sure you count the stitches on the back panel to ensure that you have the same number of stitches connecting to the front panel. So in my case, my shoulders have 21 stitches each. So I'm going to count off 21 stitches in the back panel and connect them using a stitch marker or some sort of other pin. Once you have your shoulders pinned together, you can go ahead and use the same hook that you used to make the ribbing and stitch the front panels and the back panels together at the shoulder. I've found in the past that when I use slip stitches to connect things, the fabric tends to pucker a little bit, and I don't get that same puckering effect when I use single crochets instead. So whenever I connect pieces, I like to go through the Tunisian knit stitch on the front and the back, pull my yarn through, and do a single crochet to attach them together. However, if you prefer slip stitches, that's fine too. Alternatively, if you would like to use a tapestry needle and just sew them together using a whip stitch, that's fine too. So whatever method you prefer, attach the pieces together at the shoulders. Don't attach them anywhere else yet, just the top of the shoulders. We're going to attach the rest of it later, but for now, just do the shoulders. Once you reach the end of your seam, chain 1 to finish off, and then go ahead and cut your yarn. Make sure you seam both shoulders. It should look like this on both shoulders once it's done. Let's crochet the hem for the neck. So I like to start near one of my shoulder seams. And you're going to take the same hook that you used for the ribbing, pull your yarn through, and chain one to attach it. Next, we're going to single crochet one in every stitch around the neck. Go through each stitch like you would a Tunisian knit stitch, but instead of just pulling a loop through, yarn over and single crochet one. Do this for every stitch around the neck. When you reach the shoulder seam, do a half double crochet with one loop on one side of the seam and the second loop on the other side of the seam to help you bridge the gap from the front and the back. Once you cross over the seam, carry on single crocheting one in every stitch until you reach the next seam. When you reach the next seam, half double crochet again to bridge the gap, then carry on with single crochets until you reach the end of your round. Once you reach the end of your round, slip stitch and chain one to join the round together. Then we're going to do one last round of single crochets. Unlike the previous round, you don't need to do any half double crochets at the seam. Just do one single crochet in every stitch for the entire round. Once you reach the end of your round, go ahead and slip stitch and chain one to finish off. Now before we completely move on, try and slip your sweater over your head and make sure that it fits. If you're noticing that it's too wide, you can go ahead and do another row of single crochets. But if you're happy with how it looks right now, we can move on. Let's make the sleeves. The first thing you need to do is pull your sweater over your head, position the shoulder seams so that they're sitting directly on top of your shoulders. Use a stitch marker to mark off the kind of armpit area of your sweater. This can be kind of as loose or as tight as you want. Make sure that you give your arm a bend and that when it does, your elbow doesn't go into the sleeve hole because you don't want to be looking turtly enough for the turtle club in your new sweater.
Deep cut millennial reference.
And you don't need to do this for both arms. One arm is fine. Once you have your arm openings marked off, go ahead and count the number of stitches you have for the opening. Then make sure that you have the same number of stitches on the front and back. So if you have more stitches on, say, the back than the front, just shift over your stitch marker so that you have the same number of stitches on both sides. So for me, I counted mine and I had like 53 stitches and it wasn't even on both sides. So I adjusted it up to 54 stitches and made it even on both sides. Once you know how many stitches you want for your arm openings, go ahead and mark off both arms. Then seam the sides of the front and back panel together just like you did with the shoulders. We're seaming the sides only up to the stitch markers and leaving the armholes open. The next thing we need to crochet for the sleeves is the ribbing. Now you've already made so much ribbing for this project that you're a ribbing expert, so I'm not going to go over the procedure again. Now, unlike the ribbing for the front and back panel, we don't actually have a specific measurement we're working towards, so just crochet ribbing until you have a length that fits around your wrist comfortably. Make a note of how many rows long that ribbing is and make your second ribbing with the exact same row count. Before we start crocheting the sleeves, we need to figure out exactly how long our sleeves need to be. So we're going to have to use a little bit of math to figure this out. The first thing we need to do is measure the shoulder of our sweater. So get your sweater and measure from the edge of the neck all the way to the edge of the armhole. Next, you need to measure the width of the ribbing we just made. Make sure you write all this down. Now we're ready to calculate how long our sleeve needs to be. Now the reason why we're doing it like this is because your shoulder for your sweater doesn't fall exactly on top of where your natural shoulder ends. It usually goes down a little bit over your shoulder. So taking a measurement just from the top of our shoulder to our wrist would mean that we have sleeves that are just a little bit too long for us. To calculate the sleeve length, we need to subtract our shoulder measurement and our ribbing measurement from our neck to wrist measurement that we took earlier. This will tell us how long our sleeve needs to be. To give you an example, my neck to wrist measurement was 63 centimeters. My shoulder measurement was 20 centimeters, and my ribbing measurement was just over 3.5 centimeters, so I'm going to round that up to 4. So 63 minus 20 minus 4 equals 39. And I'm going to round that up to 40 just to make my life easier. So my sleeve length is 40 centimeters. Next, we need to calculate how many rows it's going to take in order to reach our desired measurement. The reason why we're doing this is because we are going to have a couple of increased rows in this sleeve pattern, and we need to figure out how many rows we have to work with before we can calculate how frequently we do our increase rounds. The first thing we need to do in order to calculate how many rows we need is to figure out how long our regular stitches are. One way to do this would be to make a gauge, which is a 10 stitch by 10 row swatch of your Tunisian knit stitch. You use this gauge to measure the height of your rows. So for me, a 10 row height gauge of Tunisian knit stitch measures around 8 centimeters. That means 10 rows equals 8 centimeters in length. Now, for those of you who don't want to make a gauge, you don't have to make a gauge. You can just mark off 10 rows on your front panel or back panel and measure that to get a rough estimate of how long 10 rows is. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not like if it's a little bit off, it's going to throw off your project entirely. This isn't woodworking. It's not that serious. Now let's calculate how many rows we're going to have. All you need to do is take the sleeve length that we counted earlier, divided by the gauge length that we just measured now, times 10, which is the number of rows in your gauge. In my case, my sleeve length was 40 centimeters and my gauge length was 8 centimeters. 40 divided by 8 is 5. Then 5 times 10 is 50, for a total of 50 rows. Next, we need to calculate our increases. The ribbing that fits around our wrist is smaller than our armhole. So in my case, my ribbing was 40 rows long. That means my Tunisian foundation row is going to be 40 stitches wide. My armhole was 54 stitches around. That means there's a 14 stitch difference between the wrist and the armhole. So because there's a 14-inch difference between the wrist and the armhole, that means I need to increase 14 times. In this pattern, each increase row contains 2 increases. So 14 divided by 2 is 7. That means I need 7 increase rows. Now if I need 50 rows in order to reach my desired arm length, that means I need to figure out how to space out 7 increase rows among those 50 rows for my arm length. The way to do that is to divide the number of rows in your arm length by the number of increase rows you're going to have. So in my case, I need 50 rows for my arm length, and I have 7 increase rows. 50 divided by 7 is 7 point something. If you come out with a decimal point, which you probably will, just take the whole number and forget the decimal point. So in my case, that would be every 7 rows is an increase row, and the point something is just going to be a row without an increase. So if every 7th row is an increase, that means the pattern is 6 regular non-increase rows with just 1 single crochet all the way across, followed by an increase row, and then repeating until I have 50 rows. So just like we did before, we are going to put 1 single crochet across the top of our ribbing. If you remember from when we were doing our front and back panels, each row in the ribbing gets 1 single crochet. So my ribbing is 40 rows long, which means that there will be 40 single crochets across the top of my ribbing. Now, because we've already done this together before, I'm not going to take too much time explaining the parts that you already know. So go ahead and just do 1 single crochet all the way across the top of your ribbing. Now we're ready to move on to the Tunisian knit stitch portion. Once you change to your hook, we are going to do however many rows you calculated for your increase pattern in just single Tunisian knit stitches. So no increases, just 1 loop per stitch all the way across. So in my case, I need to do 6 rows of just plain Tunisian knit stitch without any increases. So go ahead and do however many rows you calculated for the beginning part of your increase pattern, and we'll come back together when we're ready to do an increase row. This is me looking super sexy, crocheting and contemplating my manifesto and single-handedly keeping the Coca-Cola Corporation in business. You can't see it on the camera, but I've got like 10 empty cans of Coke Zero surrounding me at the moment. Okay, so I've reached the end of my 6 rows, and I usually like to mark my increase row with a stitch marker so that I don't lose my place. And then each increase row has 2 increases, one at the beginning and one at the end. To do an increase in Tunisian crochet, you just pull up a loop in the space between stitches. Then go into the next stitch as you typically would. So pull up a loop in every stitch all the way across the row until you get to the last stitch. When you get to the last stitch, pull up a loop in the space before the last stitch, and then do your last stitch as normal. And then do your return pass as you typically would. Sometimes the increases are a little bit difficult to get over, or sometimes they want to like bunch up and do weird things. So just keep an eye on those. But for the most part, you just do your return pass as normal. And then once you get to the end of your return pass, then the next however many rows are going to be just regular old Tunisian knit stitch, no increases. In my case, it's 6 rows of regular Tunisian knit stitch followed by 1 increase row. Again, yours are different, so do however many rows you need to do and then an increase row. And I will meet you back here when the sleeves are all done. And once you come to the end of all of your rows, we are going to fold our sleeve in half with the right sides together and seam it together using the same technique that we used for everything else. So you go through both sides, pull your yarn through, and do a single crochet or a slip stitch, whichever you prefer, all the way up until you get to the armpit area. And then once you have your arm all seamed, you can flip it so that the right side is facing out. Now the main body of your sweater still has the right side facing in, and you're going to tuck the sleeve into the body and then match up the seams. So the seam up the sleeve and the seam up the side should match up with each other because that's going to be the armpit. And you can use a stitch marker or some sort of pin to hold it in place. And just like we did for all of the other seams, we are going to attach this together using either a single crochet or a slip stitch. Go through the stitch on the body, go through the stitch on the sleeve, pull your yarn through and either slip stitch or single crochet. Your sleeve and your armhole should have the same number of stitches. So in my case, I had 54 stitches in my armhole and 54 stitches at the top of my sleeve. Once you get that all attached, you are good to go. If this is your first arm, repeat these steps to make your second arm. If you're already done with your second arm, all you have to do is use your tapestry needle to weave in all of your ends, and then you are all done. Yay!
All right, so here's the finished sweater. Now you may notice that this is a little smaller than the one that I was wearing at the beginning of the video. I used the exact same stitch count, the exact same measurements, and the exact same type of yarn, just in a different color. And this one turned out a little smaller. That is because I have worn that other sweater so much and washed it so many times that the stitches loosened up a lot. So when I first made it, it was about this way. And then over time it loosened up. So that is just something to keep in mind, that over time your sweater is probably going to loosen up, especially if you wear it as often as I was wearing that blue sweater. But yeah, here's the final thing. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. And if you're interested in seeing more videos from me, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!